Ask everybody to take their seat for one thing.
Good morning. We invite all of you to take your seats, please. I just want to take this opportunity to thank Bishop Cantu. He's going to be introduced to us by Janet in a moment. And Bishop, thank you for taking the time to come and be with us today and be with us this morning. I just want to thank the men who are here. Yes, thank you. And I just thought about this and I said, blessed are you among women. Thank you for coming, and for all of you, thank you for coming to listen to this talk, which is very important, not just for us here, but for the world. For me especially too. This talk is very good for me. So I will now ask Janet to come and introduce Bishop Cantu.
Thank you. Yeah. Good morning. The ladies of Wings and I would like to thank our visitors and guests for joining us today to hear our esteemed speaker who inspires people across the globe to advocate for those who do not have a voice. I would like to thank Father Kwame, our parochial vicar, for extending the invitation to Bishop Cantu. I would also like to thank Annabella Estrada, Bishop Cantu's executive secretary, for her assistance in having Bishop Cantu here today. Bishop Cantu was born in Houston. He is one of 8 children of Mexican immigrant parents. He holds a master's degree in divinity and theology studies and has earned his licentiate of sacred theology from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. He also has a doctorate in sacred theology and dogmatic theology from the Gregorian. He was ordained a priest in the Diocese of Houston in 1994. In 2008, he became the youngest bishop of the United States, where he served as auxiliary bishop in San Antonio for 5 years. Then in January 2013, he was named second bishop of the Diocese of Las Cruces, New Mexico. In July 2019, he became coadjutor of the San Jose Diocese. Then in May, he was elevated to the Bishop of San Jose. He has served as chairman of the U.S. Catholic Bishops' Committee on International Justice and Peace. His talk today centers around his visits to the most troubled areas of the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and Asia. It is with great joy and gratitude that I introduce Most Reverend Oscar Cantu, Bishop of San Jose.
That introduction always makes me sound important. So, well, thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be with you this morning. So just a little bit of background with regard to my experience internationally as I represented the bishops of the United States, and I represented the Catholic Church throughout the United States internationally for a few years. As I traveled to various parts of the world, particularly some of the more troubled places of the world, to express our solidarity with the local church, to listen to a variety of voices in those particular regions. So I sat down with, first of all, my first point of contact was the local church. So I visited with the local church, with the local bishops, and listened to their voice, to their perspective, to their concerns, to their hopes and desires, and a little bit of their history. And from there, I went out and listened to nonprofits, to NGOs who are working in the area, particularly in the area of humanitarian relief, those who are working for structural change, to government representatives, to people from other countries, so ambassadors or consuls who had been observing the goings-on in those areas. So just to fill out as broadly as possible a picture of what the reality, the local reality is, what some of the troubles are, some of their root causes, and what some of the direction forward might be, policy-wise, humanly wise, and otherwise. And the purpose of that was, one, to express solidarity, to pray with the local church, and two, to come back and to advocate, especially in Washington, with legislators, with Congress, with the State Department, with the White House, for policy that alleviates those situations, for policy that brings a greater justice, a greater respect for human dignity in those particular areas. With all of the delicacies of politics that surround that. So that was essentially what I was charged with for a few years by my brother bishops. They probably said, "Oh, he's the young one, send him. Maybe he's dispensable." But yeah, everybody thought it was a great honor, but no, it was a great honor. But now a little bit of personal background, and quite frankly, when the bishops elected me to do this, there were quite a few people that were surprised, and the most among them was myself. I accepted to be placed on the ballot because they need somebody on the ballot. And usually the way things go in the bishops' conference is there's a high premium on seniority. So I had absolutely no seniority. So I was quite confident that I would not be elected. But God had a different plan, and he was laughing at the end of the day. The final two who were on the ballot, obviously myself and another bishop who had much more experience, was older than I. So I was quite confident that he would be elected. However, he had a campaign strategy, which I did not. And his campaign strategy was his slogan. People asked him whether he wanted the post, and his response was, "I have too much to do, elect Cantu." So next time I'll come up with my own slogan. So in any case, it was a marvelous opportunity. And the other piece of my background is that I have had absolutely no background in international relations. My doctorate is in dogmatic theology with a specialty in sacramental theology. And so I taught at the seminary in Houston. I taught at the Catholic University. I enjoyed teaching. I enjoyed academics. All the while I was a pastor in an inner city parish. Those were the joys of my life before I was asked to serve as a bishop. Not that all joys ended then, but but many of them did. So in any case, what I saw, the reason I accepted this position was because I already sat on the committee on international justice and peace with the bishops. And so I'd been on that committee for some 3 or 4 years, had observed the work that the committee does, had learned quite a bit. But most of all, I felt utterly confident in the capabilities and the professionalism of the staff. So had I not felt that confidence in the abilities of the staff, I would have declined, because I would not have felt that I would have done the work justice. Very capable people, one of which had expertise in Africa, another had expertise in Latin America, another in Asia, and the other in generally in global affairs, and with a specialty in the Middle East. So what I would bring to the table was just the basic elements, certainly my theological background and ecclesial background, but just a pastor's sensibilities. What would a person in the pew think? What is the general moorings of the church with regard to all of the issues that we encounter in these different areas of the world? So I felt like it was a good mixture. I brought a pastoral sensibility to the situation, and the staff was able to brief me on history, on the intricacies of and dynamics of local politics, of regional politics, and so on. So that's just a little bit of background. So I am not the expert. I learned a lot during those years, and I continue to do so. But I had to remind people that I actually had a day job during that time. I was the bishop of Las Cruces in southern New Mexico. So this was my side gig, traveling internationally and representing the church in the United States. So all of those caveats, just to keep in mind. And I continue to bring a pastor's perspective to the situations. So just a little bit, maybe I'll speak, I don't know, maybe 20 minutes or so, just to give you sort of a bird's eye view, a panorama of some of the places and issues that I encountered in my travels. And then maybe there it might elicit some questions, and we can have some time for discussion. There was, maybe I'll start with this story that I think helps to bring together a common theme throughout these encounters. As you know, Pope Francis, from the beginning of his pontificate, encouraged not only the church, but all people of goodwill to help create a culture of encounter, where we encounter people who are different from us, encounter people who live a different kind of life, and particularly to encounter those on the margins of society. That we have to go there, to the margins of society, wherever they may be. They're not always geographical. Sometimes they're in the center of our cities. But they live on the margins. Those who have no voice, or very little voice. And to encounter them, and to allow them to affect us. Those encounters will often make us uncomfortable. It'll take us certainly out of our comfort zone. But there's something that happens when we do that we encounter humanity. Just last week, I went somewhat to the margins, literally to the margins of our country, on the southern border, to El Paso, in another post that I now occupy. I serve as the bishop's liaison to migrant farm workers. So I went to the borderlands, to El Paso, also visited southern New Mexico, my old diocese, in Las Cruces. We crossed the border into Ciudad Juarez. And there was a delegation of various people who came from different parts of the country to be part of this encounter. And one of my reflections, we spent several days there encountering migrants on both sides of the border, the work that they do, they're listening to their stories and so on. It was a very moving, powerful experience as we listened to those stories, and a whole variety and panorama of experiences. And the image that I used at the end of those days that we spent in that week-long encounter was of the wounds of Christ. That Jesus, when he rose from the dead, when he appeared to the disciples, he showed them his wounds, and particularly to Thomas, who doubted his presence, his appearance. And he invited Thomas to touch his wounds. And so the reflection was that Jesus continues to invite his church, to invite his people to touch his wounds. Not historically, but in the wounds that he suffers in his members today. And that's what I believe Pope Francis means by a culture of encounter. That we're able to touch the wounds of humanity today. To see where the body of Christ suffers today. To walk in their shoes, if only for a day, if only for a moment. And in doing so, to bring some sense of solidarity. There is something that is fulfilling, that gives dignity to humanity in allowing people to tell their story. But that means that there has to be someone to listen to their story. And that's what we did during that week. We listened to people's stories. We weren't able to solve all of the problems of their lives. We were not able to change the structures, though we advocate for a just changing of structures that are unjust. But we can certainly do that. We can bring an element of dignity and respect to individuals, to their humanity, by listening to their stories and holding them up as worthy and dignified. Back to the story I wanted to highlight. During these years, and representing the U.S. or the church in the U.S., one of the regular trips that I took was to the Holy Land. There was a group of bishops who would gather each year. They've been doing so for about 20 years, and they continue to do so now. Every year, they come from Europe, from North America, and from South Africa. And it was at the request of the Vatican over 20 years ago for this group of bishops from developed countries to advocate for the two-state solution in the Holy Land. So the two-state solution is something that brings dignity to and respect and justice and hopefully peace to Israel, the people of Israel, and to the Palestinians. As of throughout its history and until now, the Palestinians have no state that has been acknowledged internationally. So we believe that that has been the long-standing position of the Vatican, the Secretary of State of the Vatican, of the Church generally, and so that's what we did. In the midst of that, we would spend about 10 days together visiting various people in Israel and Palestine, and doing some advocacy work there locally. And each year, we would go into Gaza. You're familiar with Gaza, somewhat familiar. Sort of no man's land. It has been walled off, literally, and it's a Palestinian enclave, and a very troubled history. So we would actually go into Gaza. It was not easy to get into Gaza. As a matter of fact, the first time I went in, there was we had sent our visas, we had sent the required information that was needed to get the permits to enter Gaza well ahead of time. But when we got to the gates of Gaza, we were told that only 3 of us had information, that the others never arrived. So I was one of the 3. And so the 3 of us entered, and we went into Gaza, and unbeknownst to me, I later found out that the others, rather than going back to Bethlehem where we were staying, they stayed there on the side of the wall, and they began to pray morning prayer. And one of the staffers that was with them began to live stream the bishops praying morning prayer at the walls of Gaza, because though they had sent all of the required information months before they were required, they were told by the guards at the gate that they could not enter. And all of that information, therefore, was being live streamed throughout the world. And lo and behold, in the middle of morning prayer, one of the guards comes over and says, "We found your documents." The miracles of prayer. The miracles of prayer and something called the internet. So placing strategic pressure at the right points is exactly that. It's strategic. And it sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. In this case, it did. So my brother bishops soon joined me, just to get a sense of this. As you go into Gaza, there is sort of an airport-like landing, but it's completely empty. Because the vision at one time was that the Gazans would be going and coming from Jerusalem as workers to various parts. But when the politics changed and the Gazans were not allowed to travel at all, then that was just shut down. So very few people are able to come and go, very, very few. And so as you go through that process, there are these solid steel doors that open and close, and it's always nerve-wracking wondering if they're going to open. And they eventually do. So it's a series of those kinds of doors getting to the open air. And once you get to the open air, you're not in the open air. It's a caged walkway, a caged hallway that goes for a kilometer. And along that kilometer is what is called no man's land. There are guards, Israeli guards, on the wall, and anyone who is seen crossing that no man's land can be shot. So those are the rules of engagement there. So it's best to stay in the caged hallway. So we walk for a kilometer, and then we get to a second checkpoint. Then they check our documents there, and then we're able to go into Gaza City. We went to visit the local parish, the local Catholic parish. How many of you knew there was a Catholic parish in Gaza? Anybody? None of you? One person. All right. She gets the prize. Yes. Brand new car. I didn't know. I'd never been to Gaza. I'd never had a whole lot of reason to explore Gaza. I read the newspapers, but they never talk about a Catholic parish in Gaza. But there it is. It's diminishing because any chance that any Gazans get to leave, they will leave because there is no opportunity there. The young adults are tremendously educated. A very good university there, but there are no job prospects. And so one of the greatest employers of young adults is Catholic Relief Services, an agency that is a branch of the Catholic bishops in the United States. And in over 100 countries throughout the world doing humanitarian work in our name. And so there is Catholic Relief Services in Gaza, building homes, providing jobs, providing skills, bringing a sense of dignity to people who have lost their sense of dignity. So the local pastor gave us a welcome, and his welcome went like this. Welcome to the largest open-air prison in the world. He's not Muslim. He's not even a Middle Eastern. He was Argentinian. But he was pastor there at Holy Family Parish. And that was his assessment. The largest open-air prison in the world. There are 3 Catholic schools that the church runs in Gaza, educating the Christians. Some are Catholic, others are Orthodox, and lots of Muslims. So about 80% of the students are Muslim. But they're Catholic schools. And so they don't proselytize, they don't force the faith on them, but they also don't apologize for the Catholic faith. They teach the faith as it is, and they teach a Catholic worldview, one that speaks of human solidarity, one that speaks of human dignity, that we're all created in God's image and likeness, and that dignity is to be protected, respected, and upheld. And so through this Catholic worldview, that young Muslims, and not only in Gaza, but throughout the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, where many Muslims are educated by the Catholic Church and are educated with this worldview of solidarity, of respect for human life. And so that is a service that the Catholic Church continues to provide in one of the most troubled parts of the world. Does the news ever talk about that? So those were things that brought a sense of tremendous pride to me as a Catholic. That all of these quiet, powerful things that the Catholic Church is doing throughout the world in some of the most troubled areas of the world. And we're not looking for applause or adulation, but I think that it's important to acknowledge anything bad that we do certainly gets front page. We know that. So I think this was certainly a point of pride. In any case, so the bishops, we went to visit one of the schools. We weren't able to visit all three, and we visited some of the young children and the teenagers. They had went up through high school as well. And as we were visiting some of the high schoolers, this was soon after, I forget what year it was. I don't know if it was the 100-day war. I forget if it was, I think it was 2014, that summer. And so we were there in January, so several months after the end of that 100-day war, which is catastrophic. I forget how many people were killed. Israeli citizens were killed. I want to say between 20 and 30. And between 2,000 and 3,000 Gazans were killed. So we can see the disparity just in those numbers. Certainly any human life is lost is tragic, but we see an immediate disparity there. In any case, we were talking about that and asking the teenagers what their experience was during that war. And there was this young girl that I had not been aware of this before, but I learned at that moment that she became quite famous during that 100-day war because she was tweeting out each day her experience of the war. And she quickly gained hundreds of thousands of followers. A 15-year-old girl, from her perspective. The bombs that she heard, the cries that she heard at night, the children who were crying, who didn't have their formula, who didn't have the medicine or the food that they needed, homes that were destroyed, people who looked for shelter elsewhere because their homes were destroyed, and so on. And so we spent some time dialoguing with these teenagers. And it was a time for us to leave. And so we were heading out the door of this one classroom. And just as we were doing so, this young boy, young student, stood up and he had been very quiet throughout, had not said anything. But he stood up just as we were leaving. He says, "Fathers," he says, "can I say one thing before you leave?" And so we turned around and said, "Of course." So he told us his experience. He said, "I too was tweeting out, and I didn't have as many followers as my classmate, but I did hear back from people in the U.S. and in Europe, and one person from Europe asked the question, 'Is my family okay? Do we need anything? Do we have the food that we need or supplies that we need?' And the young student replied, 'Yes, thankfully we're okay. We have enough food, we have supplies. We don't have electricity, we're in the dark,' and so on. But we're okay. We're scared, we're frightened, and so on." He says, "But what we do need is dignity." A 15-year-old boy. I'm not sure I knew what dignity was when I was 15. And likely that was a term that he learned in Catholic education. But it applied to his life in that situation, where he was experiencing a lack of respect for human life, a diminishing of human dignity. And so that became the lens through which I was able to see encounters, whether it was in Iraq after the onslaught of ISIS, whether it was visiting those who had fled from Iraq and from Syria into Jordan or into Lebanon, whether it was those young children, young girls who were trafficked from Myanmar and were brought eventually and escaped and rescued and brought into safety with a group of religious sisters, the Sisters of the Good Shepherd in Malaysia, where they gave them psychological help, spiritual help, and help to heal those wounds of being trafficked, of being sold by their own parents. Because if they didn't, they likely all would have died of hunger. And so they sold them in hopes that they might have a life and that their younger siblings might have a life. Imagine having to make that kind of decision. So that became the lens through which I was able to look at a variety of situations. Going back to Iraq, we went to Iraq a couple of times. The first time was soon after the onslaught of ISIS in the Nineveh Plains. And so the Yazidis, so it was Yazidis, Muslims, and Christians who fled the violence and the onslaught of ISIS from towns like Karakosh and Mosul, and they fled into Kurdistan to the northeast. And guess who was there? CRS, Catholic Relief Services, to help to triage all of these people who were not technically refugees because they had not fled the boundaries of their country. They're referred to as internally displaced persons, IDPs. And so they're not counted among the 70 million refugees throughout the world. They're counted among the 273 million people who are displaced, forcibly displaced from their homes throughout the world. That's close to the number of people who live in the United States. So Catholic Relief Services was there, and that was one of our main points of contact there, aside from the local church. And we listened to and visited some of the operations that they had in providing some relief, finding homes for them. Winter was setting in. And so there were many homes that had been started and were abandoned for various reasons. And so Catholic Relief Services was able to work through the bureaucracy of finding out who owned those homes, contacting them, and creating a memorandum of understanding to be able to use those homes that had been abandoned, to finish them, to weatherize them, to put windows and doors, to shield them from the cold of winter up in the mountains, and that those improvements for the home would remain there, and that they would be property of the owners in exchange for allowing these families to live temporarily in these dwellings. So that's one of the things, one of many projects that Catholic Relief Services was embarking on at that time as people had fled. And what impressed me about the work of CRS was their motto. We serve you not because you're Catholic. We serve you because we're Catholic. And so they never asked, they never made any distinctions whether they were Orthodox, whether they were Catholic, whether they were Yazidis, whether they were Muslim. They were human beings in need of humanitarian relief. So those are just a couple or a few stories of some of my experiences during those encounters in various parts of the world. I'm going to go ahead and stop here and see if you might have questions or comments.
Issues, because I'm thinking you might speak Hebrew but don't know about Arabic and Farsi. That'll go for you.
Right. Yeah. So we did have translators. So I always worked with the first point of contact was the local church, and obviously they spoke the local languages. Most of them spoke English. Some of the clergy spoke Italian, so I was able to speak to them in Italian. And my French is very basic, so when I was in the Congo in Africa, I was able to use some French. But I usually we had plenty of translators, especially with Catholic Relief Services, and some of the local employees who were hired on by Catholic Relief Services. Many of them were pretty well educated, so they spoke, if at least, some basic English, and of course the local languages. Yes?
Bishop, you mentioned that one of the goals of your trips, the group of you, was to advocate for change. Could you give an example of possibly if that worked and you were able to change anything in any of the countries that the group was in?
So I was trying to think how many letters I authored during those 3 years that I was chairman. And I don't know the number, I don't remember, but best guess was that it was somewhere between 50 and 80 letters to Congress, to the State Department, or to the White House. And with recommendations, some specific recommendations for policy that would help to alleviate many of those situations. So some of them were helpful. We were in favor of the much maligned Iran deal, as an example. We felt that while it was not a perfect deal, that it was better to have some, it was better to have a legitimate foot in Iran than to have no foot. To have some set of eyes, though not perfectly, than to have no eyes. To begin a relationship, though it was not perfectly trustworthy, but it did have many checks and balances to it. So obviously it did pass the so-called Iran deal with several other countries, by the way, and eventually it was rescinded by the new administration. And many of Congress, they needed some political backing to be able to vote for it. And so our voice became rather critical. And I was much maligned. I got not only hate mail, but death threats by good Catholics. So that was one of the few scariest moments in my experience were those death threats. And also to advocating each year for maintaining an adequate budget for humanitarian relief. There were threats and have continued to be threats to cut back in humanitarian relief. And we were able to see in the work that we did in the Holy Land the necessity of that relief. And it was, as much as it wasn't enough for really suffering Palestinians. And one of the things we forget is that the Christians in the Holy Land are Palestinians. And you never hear that. Never hear that.
That sentence, the Christians in the Holy Land are
Palestinians.
Palestinians, thank you.
Yeah. So we tend to equate Palestinian with Muslim, but not all Palestinians are Muslims. Many are. The city of Bethlehem used to be 80% Christian. Now it's about 20% because it's been essentially walled off for security purposes. And so people can't come and go to get to their jobs. They can't make a living anymore. It's harder to get there. They're not able to sustain their families. So any opportunity that they have, they go abroad. And so we're losing the church in the original church. Yes?
Seeing all the suffering of people throughout the world, do they still have a sense of hope, or do they have just this hopelessness and despair? I mean, how do they maintain hope in lieu of all this
Yeah. Yeah.
politically and in so many areas?
Yeah.
What is your experience with having spoken with some of these people?
There are many avenues and agencies and groups that look for peaceful, legitimate ways to express frustration and to find avenues that highlight injustice, that work for a dignity of those that are suffering. and for a sense of solidarity with humanity. And so there are many agencies, and among them the church. Just a brief example, one of the issues that we got involved with and we advocated for was the abandonment of a plan to build a separation wall around what is called the Crimson Valley. The Crimson Valley is roughly between Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and it's owned by 58 Christian families, most of them Orthodox, some of them Catholic, and they have vineyards there, they have olive groves, and that is their long-standing property of those families. And so the proposal of the Israeli government was to build a wall around it. And there's also at the end of that valley was a Salesian monastery, Salesian nuns, and they also had a Catholic school. And so they were going to wall the school off around three sides of it. And so families bringing their children every day to school would have to go through a checkpoint to get through the wall into the school. Well, that was going to essentially cut off the lifeblood of that school. It was going to close because as those things work, it takes anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, sometimes 3 hours to get through a checkpoint. And so parents are not just going to deal with that hassle. And so there were avenues that we and together with other nonprofit agencies were helping to advocate at the legal level and just awareness level of that issue of the Crimson Valley. And so people felt a sense of, okay, this is a direction where I can express my frustration, where I can legitimately and peacefully express and advocate for a just resolution to this, what seemingly unnecessary proposal. And when there was some back and forth, and eventually the government decided just to go ahead and build the wall. And so 500-year-old olive trees were uprooted, and the land was walled off. And some of the families who lived there said that some of the young people who had been part of that movement to advocate for a just resolution to that situation in Crimson Valley lost hope. They lost hope in the system. And the next time they saw those young people, they were throwing rocks at the checkpoint at the Israeli guards. And so that is an example of, it's not that people are born to be terrorists or to hate their neighbor or Palestinians to hate Israelis or Israelis to hate Palestinians. It's that a system that is untenable, a system that does not respect solidarity, does not respect human dignity, closes off those avenues of hope.
We have time for one more question. I'm curious, in 2008 or maybe 2007, we had someone here from Bethlehem, and he was representing the peace movement, and it was called Tent of Nations. David, I forget his last name.
Yes, I met Davide.
Beautiful man, beautiful Christian man. And he came and I felt like he offered hope, but it got complicated.
Well, very complicated.
Very complicated. And I guess for myself is, I ask this question humbly is, how do you stay hopeful? Because for myself, all of these various experiences, and it was very powerful, extremely educational, very meaningful. And here I am today feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And overwhelmed, but it's symbolic for many other issues, as we have here with the wall that is attempted to be built, and talk about a lack of dignity and in our country, and the disrespect, and we're losing that sense of respect for the human being, and no matter where they're from. And so how do you stay hope-filled? How do you feed your spirit to stay focused on God who gives hope? Because sometimes I get overwhelmed and discouraged.
Yeah, I mean, that was a question I asked myself many times as I made these trips. You know, what difference does this make? Is anybody listening? And the response for myself, you know, and I, you know, will continue to advocate, and my successor continues to do great work and advocate, and, you know, to Congress and to White House and so on. But beyond that there is a tremendous value in the visit of solidarity. One of the things that, a theme that came back in every visit that I made, recognizing that in the big picture, I was not going to make a huge dent, if any at all. But the people that I would encounter, I would listen to, and I would give them respect and dignity. And so my message to them was, I represent the church in the United States, and we want you to know that you are not forgotten. We may not be able to change the situation, certainly not immediately, hopefully in the long run. We will do what we can. But we want you to know, most importantly, that we stand with you and that you are not forgotten. And so I think that restores some sense of dignity and solidarity. One more?
I do humanity work in Africa, so I'd like to hear some of your African stories. But my other question is, every place you visit is different. And how do the people accept you, or how do they respond to you differently in the different countries that you go to?
Well, I think everywhere I went, I was well received.
By the local people?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't always speak exactly with people on the street. I spoke with representatives of various local groups and so on. Yeah, I was always well received. By diplomats and church people and non-Catholics alike. They were respectful and so on. Just a quick story. It was in the Congo, where in Kinshasa, when I was there a couple of times. Horrific situation. But visiting with the local church, and the local church is just tremendous. The smartest, the most strategic, the most well-organized, and most effective that I've encountered anywhere around the world, even including our own conference here in the United States. Just tremendous, tremendous people. In any case, just in a moment of levity with the priest who was the general secretary of the bishops' conference, he asked me my own background, and I said my parents were from Mexico. He says, Mexico. He says, what is this thing about, what do y'all call it, mañana? So I explained to him about mañana. And I said, so mañana literally means tomorrow. So when you're saying you're going to do something, it could be tomorrow, but mañana could also mean next week. It could mean a year from now or a few years from now. He says, yes, we have a similar term, but ours is not so urgent. So even in the midst of tremendous humanitarian suffering, of injustices, we have a moment of levity and of just a brotherhood and of humanity. So those were really wonderful moments. But going back to Africa, so South Sudan and the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, were the two countries that we concentrated on during my time. We tried to get into Burundi, but we were advised both by CRS and the State Department that it was not safe to go in at that time. So South Sudan, I was there for the 4th anniversary of their independence, and it was supposed to be a great day. The day of independence was a very joyful day. I was not there, but I was there for the 4th anniversary. The 4th anniversary was nothing to celebrate because 4 short years later, after independence from the North, from the Muslim and Arab majority in the North, whereas the South was primarily Christian and African and Black, one would think they would have a sense of peace and the ability to govern themselves. A rivalry began between the president and the vice president, and this horrific chasm between the two, and they were both from different tribes. And so their rivalry developed into a tribal war that eventually devolved into a civil war. Horrific violence, unspeakable. I heard the stories. Women, men, teenagers, children being raped by soldiers. Soldiers who were not paid, or not paid sufficiently, but they were told by their generals, go into the town and take what you need. And so that was the experience of the general population. And so those whose villages had been burned, who had been raided in the most horrific ways, eventually went into United Nations camps. And there were some 30 camps of 30,000 South Sudanese living in these camps for safety. Not from northern Sudan, but from their own countrymen who were from a different tribe. So, I mean, those were moments of, throwing up your hands. What do you do? What do you do now? Still tremendous efforts by the church. And everyone I spoke to was traumatized by the violence, the bishops included. Some of the bishops were interred, were put in prison, were terrorized, and horrific stories. But they continue to preach the gospel, to bring a message of peace. There was one of the the bishops, he's long retired, Bishop Paride, established a center of peace and reconciliation where he would bring people together. He would bring generals together. And the only caveat that he had, that they could come there, was that they had to leave their weapons outside. And they could say what they had to say once they were in the compound, but that was a place of dialogue, reconciliation, and peace. And so he brokered many occasions of dialogue and peace that didn't hold long term, but they held at least for some time. So there were some glimmers of hope. One step forward and 3 or 4 steps backwards. So we continue to pray for many of those situations.